Hello, welcome to the Michael Harding podcast. This is the second half, if you like. Half, I was talking about the Assumption, Mary, Queen of Heaven. And I did the first part of it as a long meditation on the idea of abandonment. And if you haven't heard it, I'd love you to go back and listen to that first and then come on to this one. Abandonment, it's a very important idea for me. It keeps me going sometimes. I get it in the Jewish tradition. I get it in the stories of Job and Abraham, and then in Jesus and in the prophets. The sense that God has abandoned us. It's in Psalm 91. It's in many Psalms, but Psalm 91 is a particularly poignant one at the moment, a very beautiful psalm. And you get it in rituals, in Jewish rituals, and the idea that, not that there is no God, because that's something we all feel sometimes, that emptiness, there is no God. But to say there is no God becomes in itself a kind of a way of faith. A negation of faith is the same as an affirmation of faith. And the other way to do it is to think about when you don't feel God's presence, when you feel really empty, when you feel just despondent, that even in that moment, you're experiencing part of the relationship with God. In the same way as, a lover feels lonely when their beloved is away, and they long for them, and they feel sad, and they feel depressed, and they feel terrible devastation. Not because there is no beloved, but because the beloved is not present. And that rhythm is the same, I think, in religious faith. And I also think that there's rhythms through the day where I am more susceptible to faith than not. And sometimes in the mornings I'm not at my best. I'm not a morning person. I don't be jolly in the morning. And if I wasn't feeling well physically, I would be quite down emotionally as well in the morning. And then as the day goes on, I have a tendency to get more high, to raise my emotions into higher planes of enthusiasm and excitement and joy. And that is a rhythm that can be reflected in the way your faith works as well, because there are times where you feel a kind of an enthusiasm, like a fervour, if you like, for religious things, and there's other times you don't. And in the morning is sometimes that I don't. And I like the idea of, having a relationship with God and feeling abandoned. That in itself is a really interesting way to go about times when you feel alone, or times when you feel there's no point to religion. And that gives it better colour, I think, to religious faith. So I talked about all that in the last one. And I talked about it as a preliminary to this amazing kind of conversation to have about the Assumption of Mary into heaven. It's an idea, it's a story, it's a tradition, it's a reality that's in all the Christian church, East and West, Orthodox and Roman Catholic. There are slight differences. In the Roman Catholic Church, people believe that Mary was assumed into heaven, that she did not die, that at the end of her life she was taken, body and soul, into heaven. And that's the assumption. And in the 1950s, in Roman Catholic Church, that was defined as a dogma. It was defined as like that's as important to believe as the resurrection of Christ. Which was a really amazing thing to do, You're putting the mother completely there, centre stage, crucial to the whole process, the whole revelation, the whole story of redemption and whatever. And the only difference with the Orthodox tradition is that they talk about the dormition of Mary. So they say that, Mary, it's sometimes it's called the going to sleep of Mary. So it's a feast that reflects on Mary having had a long life, and then she dies, and then after her death, she's raised. She's resurrected and brought to heaven, body and soul. Saying body and soul is interesting too, because there's a way where, if you look at icons of the Dormition of Mary, you'll see that Mary is stretched like in a coffin or on a shroud or at the grave or wherever, and beside her stands erect the figure of Christ, the risen Christ, in gold and sometimes with dark purple or black circle behind him, like an almond shape, which is the same thing that we talked about in the Transfiguration. This is the risen, glorified Christ, the cosmic Christ, the end of all time, omega point. And in that image, you'll see that the Christ is holding what looks like a little baby, but it depicts the soul that has been taken from Mary's body, and Christ is taking the soul home. And then the tradition is also in the Dormition that she too, her body was taken, so that they're saying body and soul, she was taken into heaven because she was resurrected. I mean, I don't know about that. The icon tells me that maybe the very original of the narrative was her soul was one with Christ. And maybe because the soul is seen as integral to the body, then the body must have been resurrected. And all this stuff, all those ideas about Mary seem very remote and exotic if you're living in the 21st century the way we are in the West. Because we read them like this is only gobbledygook. I mean, Richard Dawkins or the other Hitchens and all the various new atheists, they would tear you to pieces with this stuff. Like they would think, Jesus Christ, such shite you're talking. And forgive me for saying it like that, but that's really the sense that people would look at you like you had two heads, talking about the Assumption of Mary, when we now have telescopes that are, billions and billions of miles out in the universe, tracking radio signals from stars that, their light has been coming to us from billions of years ago. They'd say, are you mad to still believe in it, to still believe in that stuff? And that's why I went the way I did in the previous podcast. I talked about this whole experience of being abandoned. Because modernity, the world we live in, the secular world, that also is a place where you can begin to feel a little bit stressed by religion. You can get isolated within religion. You can be religious or going to services or prayers or mass or, and you're kind of hiding it because you're thinking, Jesus, this doesn't work with the modern life. And then because the old-fashioned religions have views about sexuality that are completely opposed to the kind of ideas you'll get in modern society, and modern society has a reading of religion that it is misogynistic, that it is patriarchal, that it really needs to go because it was doing very bad things to women. All those things make it quite difficult to maintain faith at a public level, and sometimes even at a private level. So again, you can end up in a situation where you just leave it there and you say, okay, there's no God. I get on with, get out my iPhone and text somebody and WhatsApp somebody and look at Facebook and pass the time and blah de blah. And you don't realize that you're doing the same thing. You're behaving religiously all the time. But you've made a kind of a disposition in relation to the possibility of a God, a ground of being, an ultimate presence that loves you and that expresses itself in the very molecules of the cosmos, so that you are the God, you are part of an entanglement of love. And that all this thing in physics is actually fundamentally theology as well. You can read it as evolution, but you can read it as creation. You can look out on the world. I can look out on my beautiful hydrangea, which is beginning to bloom. I can look out at it and think science, or I can think the hand of God, the fingerprint of God. And I can have that relationship of, thou-ness, otherness, with the tiniest little insect, the tiniest little ant, or I can just contemplate it in a rational way if I know the science of how that little ant evolved. So it's like I can read the universe with my head or with my heart. And we live in a world where collectively we read everything with the head and we tell the heart that's a rubbish way to look at the world. Because it's just the heart, it's just silly. I always remember a fella saying, they were asking him, what do you think of that fella? Is he trouble? No, says the boss man, he's only a poet. He's only a poet. They're silly people. They're window dressing on corporate society. We don't have anything to fear from poets because that's all silly. Metaphors are not real. Metaphors, in a sense, are lies. Fiction is a lie. That's the funny thing about fiction. People would say now, when you write a book, they would say, is it fiction or is it true? When they were writing novels in the 19th century, Dickens or Dostoevsky, they weren't asking was it true. They knew it was true. A novel was true. Its truth was at a different layer of meaning. Its truth was deeper than what is rational. So it wasn't historically accurate, maybe. You were inventing characters, but as the characters worked out their story in the novel, you were showing people the truth. Exactly the same way with the resurrection. If you read the resurrection literally, and most people who are atheists do, and then they say, well, that's silly, because scientifically I'm not buying the idea that some kind of, Superman alien zoomed up from the grave, beamed me up, Scotty, and floated around for a while and then vanished into the sky. And if he did vanish into the sky, if Jesus did go up, like you see in the clouds, well, where did he go? I mean, did he go to the moon? Did he go to Mars? Where did he go? So they say, well, that's silly. And it's a complete misreading, in the same way as misreading novels. But it's a misreading of religious texts are true at a much deeper level, at the level of the heart. But totally true. And it's in that context that you have to come to something like the Assumption of Mary into heaven. After all that's told about the story of Jesus, and the story of Jesus begins at Christmas, right? The birth of Jesus, then all the various things happen, then Good Friday, and then Easter Sunday, and then Pentecost. And what do you do then? After the whole thing is over, you reflect on Mary, his mother, and what happened to her because she was still alive when he died. And then gradually there develops in the liturgical year a pattern of reflecting on Mary before Christmas, so that there are lovely and beautiful festivals of Mary in September, October, November and December. Right through that period. I know they do if you take November as the month of the dead, but there's beautiful festivals, and particularly, I have to say, in Orthodoxy, they have some really big Marian festivals about Mary in September. But all over, all Christian churches celebrate this middle of the summer or the beginning of autumn, if you like, which it really is the beginning of autumn. In Irish, it's called Muramor an Or, Great Mary of the harvest. They also say Muramor, Great Mary. That more, Big Mary, or it's interesting because that's used a lot in Orthodoxy as well, you know. They talk about the Great Fast or the Great Feast or Muramor, the Great Mary. And the story is going to conflict with reality because you said that, well, if the mother of Jesus lived, she definitely died. And if she died and her body decomposed in the ground, and that's it. Very good book on this would be Colm Tóibín's book, Testament of Mary. It's written from a very secular point of view, and it's worth reading just to kind of hear the secular view. So the narrative is written as if it's the first person Mary speaking about these lunatics, the apostles, these lunatics who keep coming to her. You know, this is after the whole crucifixion is over, and these guys keep coming to her to get her story. But it's like they want her story to be a particular story, and they're doctoring it as they go along, and they're frustrating her. Not a book that you'd be reading if you wanted to kind of cheer yourself up about Mary, the Mother of God, in your life. But it's a really, really well-written, beautiful reflection from a secular point of view about Mary. And I think that the same way as in the previous podcast I talked about abandonment, I talked about despair, they're the emotional grounds on which you have to stand before you talk about, you know, Mary floating up into the sky and ended up in heaven. And in the same way, from a kind of an intellectual point of view, you know, you need to be reading what modernist writers, novelists, poets, philosophers say about all this stuff before you decide whether you can embrace it or not. Like if you're embracing, and most atheists will accuse you of being naive. That's one of the problems having a conversation with somebody who is a very dogmatic atheist, that they will already be convinced that your position is not just wrong to have faith, but that you're naive to have faith, that you actually are holding on to faith because you're too stupid to know all the secular ideas that are in the world. And that can be tricky, having that conversation, because if you have already read the secular world, if you've already said to yourself that I can see the scientific point of view, I've read Dawkins, I think he's right, I think he's powerful, and yet I still have faith. So now you're talking about faith in a very different context than the faith that atheists are trying to accuse you of having. It's like we constantly get an image of, in Ireland, we constantly get an image of 1950s Catholicism. And half a century later, let's say in 2000, we'll still get narratives in the movies of faith as it was in the 50s. Ignorant, naive, people who are terrified of institutions anyway. You know, the terror that people felt in Ireland in the 1950s when the population had been reduced to 2.5 million, when the grip of economic isolation from Britain that happened during and after the war was really having an effect, and people were poor. People were really so poor. They were so poor, it's really hard for us to understand how poor they were and how terrified people get when they are poor. When you are poor, it's a terrible place to be. You're frightened and you know that you don't have a freedom intellectually. You know that you don't have freedoms about opinions. You have to go with where the food is or where the job is. People went to war in the First World War. Many soldiers, young Irish boys, went to war because they knew their job was at stake. They knew that if other people in the firm were going to war, they would be frowned on if they didn't sign up, or how that might affect their families if they were working for a landlord or they were tenants on a farm or something. They knew, I just better enlist. I have to do this. Poverty is a trap. It traps your freedom. It constricts your options. So all that kind of terror, I think, would have been going on in the 50s, regardless of whether the church was the controlling power or the state was the controlling power or anybody else. And I sometimes think that maybe, people don't remember that now. So that when people are depicting Catholicism, it's constantly this idea of a very, poor, terrified, bewildered people, illiterate, who are being devotional. And I think what's always missed is that there's been 70 years since then. It's 1953, 2023. That's 70 years. And to embrace faith now has a different colour on it than then. Okay, I better bring this to a close. To sum up, I think that the option to believe, the option to be a Christian, or the option to be Muslim or Buddhist, it's a very different thing now than it was 50 years ago. There have been so many changes that we have seen the institutions collapse and lose their authority. Much of that, 99% of it, has been really good and liberating for everybody. However, the problem is sometimes that the atheist or the modernist looks upon religious faith as something that's naive and innocent. And they look at something like the Assumption of Mary into heaven as something that is silly, because it so conflicts with science and is so similar to childish comics, bodies coming up out of the ground and floating up into the sky. So they're not reading it right. And finally, and this is the guts of the previous podcast. This was all one podcast, but I had to just split it in two. In the first half, I tried to focus on abandonment. I tried to say that if you experience a sense of godlessness, that there is no God, you don't feel there's a God, you don't pray, you're outside the whole tradition and you look upon it as something naive that people used to do in the past, okay. That's the way you look at it. And that's like taking a position. It's like taking a religious position in itself, because rather than affirming there's a God, you're saying there is no God. And that in itself is a proposition. That's an idea. It's not mathematics. It's your position. I believe there is no God. So that can lead to a kind of an emptiness, a kind of a hole where God used to be, a kind of a meaningless in life. And I'm sharing with you my story, which is that in my experience in my life, it's possible to live that emptiness as like in a relationship when you're lonely for your lover. When your lover is not present, when she has gone away, or he has gone away, when they have gone away, they're not present, you don't feel they don't exist. Even though they're not present in your life, but you live in the longing. You live in the longing for them. And I think that that model is a good way to think about having a relationship with God, because you're experiencing not that there is no God, but you're experiencing the loneliness of being abandoned by God. And to be abandoned by God is a template. It's a kind of a space that if you live like that, you begin to realize that the abandonment in itself is part of the relationship. Just as living, if you're away from your beloved and you have to live without them for a long period of time, and you're feeling the pain of their absence, in a strange way it's also strengthening your relationship. That they're there in the absence. That the absence strangely turns itself into presence. John Donne, the metaphysical poet, 1600s, he had some beautiful poems about this idea. The absence and the longing for somebody who is not there. And so the word abandonment, it comes up in the Old Testament, in the scriptures of Judaism. Beautiful, powerful wisdom in the book of Job and Amos and Isaiah, and particularly when Jesus is on the cross, he doesn't use Psalm 91, but Psalm 91 is the reassuring psalm. It's the psalm that says, even if you feel I'm not there, I will always be there. And it's a beautiful psalm to say when you are in despair, even though the words contradict your emotions. You're feeling God has abandoned me, I am alone, I'm in despair, and yet the words in Psalm 91, you're saying God will always protect me. And that contradiction or paradox, linguistically, is sort of opening out the idea that even abandonment is part of the relationship and strengthens the relationship. And then there is the moment where God returns, where you can feel a sense of joy coming back to you, and it's so, so beautiful. And that sometimes corresponds, I think, in my life, what I'm saying is that corresponds to cycles of the day, cycles of the year, and cycles of life. So a cycle of the day would be, for me, I'm not a morning person. I'm kind of a little bit melancholic always in the mornings, always was from the time I was a baby. And as the day goes on, I get I get higher, I get more exuberant. I'm at my highest emotionally positivity in the evenings, late at night. And then the mornings, I'm kind of a bit down again. That's a rhythm. So if I ever hit depression, which I did, I find that the mornings would be worse than the evenings. And that cycle also has a yearly shape to it, because I know that there's people who are, many people close to me, we all know people who find it very difficult to get through the winter. Personally, I always take vitamin D. I hope it helps. I think it does. But people going through the winter can have that awful feeling of sadness, despondency, depression through the winter. And finally, I think illness creates it. Physical illness can cause a sense of melancholy to intensify, or a sense of depression to intensify. And that too is a rhythm, because there's the rhythms of times in life when you go through illness, which are patterns. I was as healthy as a trout in my 50s, and then in my 60s, nearly the entire decade was one thing after another. So that's a rhythm. And so the final rhythm is to do with age. That there's an inevitable entropy, or kind of wearing out of energy, that happens at the end of life, whereby as you get older, You don't have the boyish or girlish enthusiasms that you did have when you were a young fella or a young one, and you were full of the joys of spring, as they say, when you're young, and everything is wonderful and everything is new, and I'd be in prayer meetings with me 2 hands over my head singing the glories of the Spirit and He is Lord, and doing Taizé chants and all the rest of it. Really beautiful, enthusiastic music and song coming out of my heart as a young person, totally feeling the embrace of God. Oh, the joy of it. And knowing that as I get older, that will wane, that will go away. I won't be able physically to get the emotions in the same enthusiastic way about I am born again in Jesus or something. Sometimes you see, a stronger stoical attitude coming into people's faces as they get older. And we call it wisdom. So there's so much to say about that. I want to keep it simple. There's the whole shape and structure, I think, of what can be called losing your faith, but it also can be called experiencing abandonment by God. And the second way of looking at it allows you to walk around the world knowing that it is empty of God, knowing that this is the reality we live in, there is no God. But it's not that there's no God, it's that He has abandoned you. And that's a really terrible thing. It's upsetting. Why would God abandon me? And then you read Psalm 91 and you read, even in the abandonment, you're not abandoned. And this is where religion necessarily brings in this contradictory language. It brings in symbols and signs that are signs of contradiction, that they go against everything that we understand in our worldview, including the science of it. So that if you take the Dormition story, and this is really where I'm coming to about the assumption,